The Ballad of the Mountain Millionaires. Listen to a story about a man named Jed, a poor mountaineer who barely kept his family fed. Then one day he was shooting at some food, and up to the ground come a bubbling crude oil, that is, black gold, Texas tea. Well, the first thing you know, old Jed is a millionaire. The kinfolk said, "Jed, move away from there." Said, "California is the place you ought to be." So they loaded up the truck and they moved to Beverly Hills, that is, swimming pools, movie stars. The Beverly Hillbillies. Under the bright California sun, Ellie Mae stood in the yard, her eyes wide as she pointed toward the road. She called out to her father, asking what kind of sign it was. It was a great big thing, colored in red, white, and blue, and she thought it was real pretty. Jed stepped out to look, reading the bold letters that proclaimed a welcome for a hero. He was puzzled and asked if she had found out who ordered it to be put up. Ellie Mae confirmed that the workers said it was Mistress Drysdale. This was truly puzzling to Jed, as they had not always been on the best of terms with their neighbor. He decided they'd best go talk to her, noting that the sign was a big rascal and quite pretty, just as his daughter had described. He looked around for the fellows who had installed it, but they were already gone. He asked Jethro if he recognized anyone, or if he knew where the sign came from. Jethro repeated that Mistress Drysdale had it put up, though he claimed not to know why. Jed mused that she must think one of them was a hero. Jethro, puffing out his chest with pride, declared that the hero was him. Jed was skeptical, asking what his nephew could have possibly done for their neighbor. Jethro explained that he had saved her valuable French poodle dog. Granny chimed in, eager for another great story about that poodle dog. She asked how he had managed the rescue. Jethro recounted that he was out back that morning when he heard the dog whining. He looked through the hedge and saw a sissy-looking fellow who had a hold of the poodle and was cutting off all its hair. Jethro told the man to let go of the dog, but the man ignored him. Jethro went through the hedge and asked again, but the man just kept on cutting. Finally, Jethro grabbed a hold of him and shook the dog loose. The man kept yelling something that sounded like masseur, so Jethro told him to go back to his sewer and leave the dog alone. When the man slapped him, Jethro became an awful man. He picked the fellow up and chucked him into the swimming pool to cool him off. The man scampered out and took off like a wet jackrabbit with Mistress Drysdale chasing after him, yelling a name that sounded like Henri. Jethro remarked that he was indeed the henneriest little fellow he ever did see. Meanwhile, inside the Drysdale mansion, Margaret Drysdale was in a state of absolute despair. She lamented that she would never be able to get Henri to make another house call, and now she was blacklisted with every poodle beautician in Beverly Hills. She looked at poor Claude, the poodle, who had to wear a raincoat, so no one could see he was only half-clipped. She told the dog to go to his daddy for comfort, which prompted Melbourne Drysdale to snap, telling her to stop calling him that dog's daddy. He called her heartless and cruel, while she complained about the ghastly mourning she had endured, especially since the sign people had failed to deliver the welcome hero banner for the front of their house. Melbourne told her not to worry about that, as he had a tremendous hero's welcome waiting at the bank for their nephew, Lance Bradford. Margaret corrected him, stating Lance was her nephew, not his. Melbourne grumbled that he could be a father to a dog, but not an uncle to a hero. He counted the costs of the reception, noting $1,500 for an electric sign, $600 for bleachers, $400 for a band, plus confetti and streamers. He remarked that even the astronauts did not have a bigger reception. Margaret insisted Lance deserved it all as the pride of the Air Force, known as Jetstream Bradford. Melbourne agreed, but asked for one favor in return. He wanted to invite the Clampetts. Margaret refused, even though they were neighbors and the bank's biggest depositors. Melbourne knew that fact, but Margaret believed everything would change once Lance took over the bank. Melbourne clarified that while he was making Lance a vice president, he was not taking over. Margaret was certain it was only a matter of time because Lance was brilliant, daring, and possessed the personality to bring in staggering accounts. Suddenly, a secretary interrupted to say the driver had called from the Air Force Base. The hero's plane had landed, and they were on their way. Margaret was thrilled and told Melbourne they must be ready. She ordered him to get into his uniform. Melbourne pleaded not to be made to wear the ridiculous outfit, but Margaret insisted it was patriotic and that he should feel honored to portray Uncle Sam. Back at the bank, Melbourne called Jed Clampett. He told Jed there was no time to explain, but invited the whole family to the bank for a big hero's reception. Jed told the family the news, and they all assumed the party was for Jethro because of the dog rescue. They headed down to the bank in high spirits. At the curb, Melbourne, dressed as Uncle Sam, was miserable. He begged his staff not to make him do this, but they assured him he looked great. He even promised a bonus to his assistant, the right to keep the beard. When the car arrived, the band started playing and flags waved. Lieutenant Lance Bradford stepped out, and Uncle Sam saluted him, thanking him for his valorous service before introducing him to the president of the Commerce Bank. Lance addressed the crowd, claiming he joined their ranks not as a hero, but as a fellow employee. He told them not to look up to him as a hero, but as the boss's nephew. The ladies in the crowd were smitten, calling him a dreamboat. Lance saluted them back, but in his excitement, he accidentally walked into a pole and knocked himself silly. The Clampetts arrived just as the poor fellow was being tended to. Jed felt bad that the man had flown all the way from Texas for Jethro's reception, only to get hurt. Jethro was still convinced the party was for him. Melbourne was mortified, calling it an unqualified fiasco. When Lance started to come around, he didn't know where he was. Allie Mae introduced herself, and Lance, trying to maintain his image, told her to call him Jetstream. He claimed his reflexes were like lightning, despite just having walked into a door. He decided to take a look around the bank, asserting that his Air Force training allowed him to recover from any crash instantly. However, disaster struck again. While the employees were all outside for the celebration, someone had robbed the bank. Melbourne was devastated. The Clampetts decided it was time to go home. Jethro was struggling to drag the dog along, while Melbourne argued with the police on the phone. He couldn't provide a description because everyone, including the security guards, had been outside waving balloons and pendants. Margaret arrived, demanding the Clampetts be arrested for kidnapping their dog. She claimed Jethro was dragging Claude away while the rest of the family waited in a getaway truck. Melbourne told her to stop worrying about the dog because the bank had been robbed. Lance joined them, criticizing the sloppy way the bank was run. He suggested he needed to take the company plane up for a spin to unwind. When he found out the bank didn't have a plane, he was disappointed, suggesting they needed an executive jet for $500,000 to give the institution some class. Melbourne had a cheaper idea. Lance could just take the dog for a walk. Later that afternoon, Lance went over to the Clampett house to invite Allie Mae to the homecoming party Margaret was throwing. He found her with a tray of what he thought was homemade fudge, but it turned out to be something else entirely. Lance met Jed and Granny. Jethro introduced Lance with a long string of heroic titles. Lance boasted about his life in the sky, talking about dogfights. When Jed asked about his latest tangle with a Russian jet, Lance admitted the last one was with a French poodle. Granny was suspicious and thought Lance needed medical attention. She went to mix up a prescription while Jed left the young people to get acquainted. Out by the pool, Lance tried to impress Allie Mae with stories of flying through storms at 20,000 feet. He confessed that if the stewardess hadn't given him a sedative, he never would have made it. Margaret rushed over, screaming that the Clampetts were trying to snare Lance with a blonde vixen. She insulted Allie Mae, calling her a peasant and a low-bred hussy. Jed tried to defend his daughter, but Margaret was beyond reason. Lance, overwhelmed by the chaos, admitted that if he could swim, he would have joined the Navy just to get away. Despite the misunderstandings, the day ended with the family together. They realized that no matter how much money they had or how many heroes they met, they still had each other. In the world of Beverly Hills, things were rarely what they seemed, but the Clampetts remained exactly who they were, kind, honest, and always ready for the next adventure.